Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session titled The Journey for Liberation and Free Speech at Public Universities, featuring Joseph Martinez, presented by the UC Davis Campus Community Book Project. My name is Megan Macklin, and I serve as a program manager in the Office of Campus Community Relations at UC Davis, where I manage the book project. Thank you for joining this afternoon. To begin, a couple of housekeeping items for our virtual event. Today's event features live captioning from Otter Live Notes. To access the transcript, click on the red live icon on the top left of your Zoom screen. You also can access the transcript by navigating to the link that we'll be putting into chat. Today's event is being recorded, and a recording of the event will be made available on the book project website. We encourage you to turn on your video if you feel comfortable doing so. It's great for our speakers, especially to see faces. And we invite you to use the chat to share any thoughts or ask any questions at any point during this event. And I also want to apologize that we don't have our typical PowerPoint showing for this intro portion because unfortunately my computer is probably about to crash. So hopefully I don't lose you all over the course of the event. I'll give a short introduction about the Campus Community Book Project. The Campus Community Book Project promotes dialogue and encourages community building by having folks across campus and our broader communities read the same book and attend related events. The book project is a signature initiative out of the Office of Campus Community Relations since 2002, and it promotes equity and inclusiveness, fosters dialogue, and improves both the campus climate and our campus community relations. Currently, the book project is in its 20th year. In 2021-2022, we're featuring the theme of social justice in practice, and our selection is Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. In support of our theme and selection, we're hosting an annual year-long program of lectures, panels, book discussions, film screenings, performances, exhibits, and more. You can find more information about the book project program at the book project website. We also invite participation from our community that includes campus staff, faculty, students, and community members as well in selecting the featured book for the book project and also in helping plan our annual program. For more information about getting involved with the book project program, please feel free to visit our website or send us an email. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Joseph Martinez is the Student Expression and Campus Activities Coordinator at the UC Davis Center for Student Involvement. He advises student organizations on campus whose primary purpose focuses on work with ethnic, cultural, identity-based communities and with advocacy and political groups. He has 15 years of experience in the UC system with previous positions at Riverside and Santa Cruz campuses and over 20 years in California higher education. His experience at higher education institutions in California has provided great opportunities to learn from both students and professional staff on how to support student expression on college campuses. Joe earned his undergraduate degree in political science at the University of Laverne and completed a master's degree in organization communication at the University of the Pacific. His committee work at UC Davis focuses on opportunities to learn, raise awareness, and advocate for students and staff in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on campus. He currently serves as the co-chair for the University of California Office of the President Student Life Work Group, and during the COVID-19 pandemic has brought together University of California campuses, California State Universities, and California community colleges to create the California Student Engagement Collaborative. Joe, we're so thrilled to have you today, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Megan, and thanks everybody for joining. Before we get started, I just want to take some time to acknowledge the land that we're all on. And if you are currently on Turtle Island, this is a land that's also known as, formerly known as North and Central America. So it's very important for us to acknowledge that land. It's critical for us to remember that this land here at UC Davis is Patman land. It's been continued to be taken care of over the many generations. As those folks continue to, from their elders, to be given guidance on how we continue to take care of that land, and as we can continue to learn, provide opportunities here at UC Davis. You can also look at nativelands.com. You can get more information about where you might be learning from or coming from today. And if you want to find out more information about that, let me know. I also want to take sure that we acknowledge the labor, right? So for those of us here that are learning from what we have called the United States, it's very important for us to acknowledge that what we know about this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the horror of transatlantic trafficking and through and continue to go through the historical violence and through what has been happened through Jim Crow laws. We are indebted to the labor and their sacrifice and must acknowledge the tremors and violence that continues through generation as we continue to find resulting that we can work towards these injustices and solving these injustices. So that's part of what my hope in this journey, that I continue my ongoing journey and through this pathway of better understanding more of the stories that are not being told, that weren't told in my understanding. So this, and through my self-education, I came through this process and came to the component of the Journey for Liberation and Student Expression at public universities. And I think people can acknowledge within the chat, but for those of you, if you've heard about, free speech on college campuses and the free speech movement, most people, I was presented with that it all began at UC Berkeley. And so maybe if you are able to put in the chat where, if you also agree that that's the story that you've been told or the story that you've heard, did it begin at UC Berkeley? Seeing some of the chats there. I think we also can use reactions as well. Yeah, and thank you, Lena, for acknowledging that. I know, Lena, my dear friend knows these. They know the history, right? It began much more beyond that. And so that's part of what this presentation is. For me, it was the journey of me realizing, and it came for some students. Some students talked to me about, so like, hey, Joe, there's much more to this history. And we'd like to explore some of that with you. So I went through some of the learning process to better understand the things that I was missing, the stories that I wasn't hearing, the stories that weren't being shared. So that's part of this presentation. I do want to make sure that folks do know that during the presentation, it does discuss events of violence on the Black community, as well as violence on college campuses during protests that did result in deaths at some of those universities or during those, as those students work towards free expression and liberation. So in here, just as a reminder, I'm sure most folks know that, in the First Amendment, what came along with that is, Congress would not pass any laws that would prohibit anything towards free access of freedom of speech, the press, the right of peaceful assembly, petition the government for grievance, and all of those things within there. For quite some time at public educational institutions, they were able to have policies within their own about how they would proceed and how they would deal with potential situations that would happen with that. That was all the way up until 1943. And at 1943, there was a case that went in the West Virginia State Board of Education in Barnett. And essentially this had to do with families wanting to look more at their freedoms of expression, and the component of that, students at the school were being forced to salute the flag or say the Pledge of Allegiance in that public school. And with this case in 1943, what it said is that educational institutions could also not put forward policies that would prohibit free speech and freedom of expressions on the college and educational institutions. So one of the things that we knowing is and I just went through and looking at some areas, right? So I started looking within the 60s, right? Civil rights movements that's going on in the 60s and trying to find out a little bit more, and through this educational process, where we got to from today. And as we continue to progress, we need to remember those folks who started doing some of this work. And this probably, this even began for the 60s, but I'm taking some snapshots of some of those things. When we hear about the Greensboro Four, right? These were students at North Carolina Agricultural and Tech School. These four people went to the Wills Ruth in North Carolina. And these four students, so this was Azelle Blair, Franklin McKay, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, sat down at that Wills Ruth counter in the hopes to be able that they were going to be served. And as we know, it took quite some time as we're doing that. And they were very strategic about it. They did have some folks that were there in support within them. They got the news folks there very quickly. And over several days working towards this movement, they also had many other college students at different campuses that also started working towards these things. And we saw what happened as these sit-ins at diners in the hopes to desegregate at these restaurants and at these diners to be able to have things change. So going against the segregation components, we started to see some of those movements that were moving along with the civil rights movement and within the history. One of another examples of that was happening in Alabama. And there in Alabama, this was in February 20th of 1960s, there was about 29 students that had went to the courthouse. And in a similar situation, they went to the courthouse cafeteria. And with these folks, with these 29 folks, they went through and the institution, because they were at the Alabama State University, 29 of the folks that were there were disciplined, but there were particularly 20 of them were put on probation, but there were 9 particular students that were expelled. So this was James McFadden, Leon Rice, Howard Shipman, but there was particular 6 students that started a pathway that were really going to make significant change within university institutions and public institutions. And those 6 men were John Dixon, Bernard Lee, Wharton Whites, Edward English Jones, my apologies, Joseph Ferguson, and Aura Embry. These were the people that were the plaintiffs in the case of the Alabama State Board of Education that went to a federal court of practice. And what was happening is that the governor there in Alabama, and as you can see within the pictures, can you all see my cursor or just the pictures? Not sure if you can see the pictures, but within those pictures, you can see what was happening there in the courthouse. But it was these gentlemen that put their bodies on the line to continue this movement, right? Prior to this component, prior to this case, universities were able to make decisions in what was called parental locus, basically saying is that the university could make the decisions upon the students because they were students at the university, right? They were not given due process prior to this. And when this case was won, Dixon versus Alabama, this case then made it so that college institutions had to provide due processes for students that were allegedly violating policy, state laws, et cetera, right? So this was pivotal in the moment within the history for liberation for our students. Right? Without the work of these 6 folks and those people who are in support of them, without the folks that were there, the Greensboro 4, we wouldn't have been able to make the progress that eventually led to some of the other things that we're seeing at college campuses, right? So these things were happening prior to the things that were happening at Berkeley. So we could go to Berkeley, right? And so we look at the things that were happening at Berkeley. In Berkeley, this was happening in October 1st through 2nd of 1964. What had happened at Berkeley, the institution had made some decisions that they were no longer in Sproul Plaza, which was one of the main plazas where student organizations would take. The university had sent something out to their dean of students at that time, essentially saying that the university students were not able to table if it was focusing on campus political activity. And within that, the students saying, hey, no, this is against our freedom of expression. This is against our free speech policies. And violating our constitutional rights. So within that movement, the things that were going across was that there was students that continued to push within the movement saying, no, these are our rights, these are things going on. At one time in September, there was 500 students that had entered Sproul Hall within a sit-in, and eventually got to a point to where there was one student that was going during those demonstrations that was happening on October 1st. And within these students, from the story that's being told that I've read, is that at Berkeley, it was these students that fighting towards getting support towards the civil rights movement, also towards getting sharing more information about different protests and things that were going on, about the wars that were going on, about the movement trying to change. Being able to have more moving away from oppressive backgrounds and histories that are happening within the United States and that was happening at the institutions, trying to fight for that liberation. So within that, on October 1st, it came to a pivotal point to where one of the students was about to be arrested. And so they had put the person within the police car. And within that, students then surrounded that police car for over 36 hours, essentially saying, this is not going to happen. You're not going to be able to remove this person. We're here in support of that person. And so you see within that picture there, it's Mark Savea was one of those people who was having discussions, and the students went to the chancellor's office. They went with the dean's students. And they eventually started to also incorporate folks from the governor's office and the regents. And within that, they're having the discussions about, they took the list of demands, essentially saying, here's some things that we need to come in agreement on. Like, we understand that you cannot violate our First Amendment rights, but we can understand that we'll come to an agreement on what they started to name as time, place, and manner, right? And so within that liberation that was going on there was something that was going to be followed on for many campus. It was that moment that people then would say that this was, quote, the birth of the free speech movement, right? But acknowledging those works from the other folks that had been doing that in there, right? There were many of other protests that were happening at other campuses, but this protest particularly that was happening at Berkeley, and maybe it's our accessibility within the UC system and the education that I was receiving to where this had been highlighted by so many different folks. But within there, what happened with time, place, and manner is that the institution and the students came to an agreement that would be practiced at other institutions, that in the sense of that, there was an agreement that the university could come up with some content neutral policies that would take into consideration the time, the place, and the manner of what things would be happening in expressive activities at the institutions. So some examples of this would be the time, right? So for currently in most college campuses, there are policies that are at public institutions about amplified sound and using those within reserved spaces. So particularly here at UC Davis, amplified sound with permits for reserved spaces can be used during the noon hour. So from noon to 1 or after, I believe 6 o'clock, right? So for events that have reservations. The component of that and the ideas behind that is so that it's not disruptive of the institution's classes, et cetera, and things towards that. The other component that comes along is place, right? So they're talking about, there's current policies for posting and flyers, banners being hung on buildings, right? So saying, hey, it's not based on the content of what's being posted on those flyers, what's being posted on those banners, but necessarily having a content neutral component of that. There's policies of where things can be posted, how they're going to be posted, and where they can be posted at different places on campus. The other component is manner, right? And so it could be that we have open air evangelists. And so I've had to have these discussions with open air evangelists that will come to campus with signs and such, and saying things that could be many folks would say, you know, this is not conducive to our principles of community are within our campus. So in some of those discussions, I may have talk with them about, hey, you know, in this particular place, it's reserved by another organization. They have the space. We can't use amplified sound, but we could find another area for you. And we're not saying that you couldn't say these things, but within that, you cannot be disruptive of another space that's being reserved. You cannot use amplified sound without having the process being able to go through to reserve an event and have an event and those types of things. And those are some of the things for us, and I'll talk a little bit more about our response team about how we approach the situation to try to say, like, how can we work together within this to take into consideration time, place, and manner. So another thing of the story, and this was another area to where some students had, you know, talked with me after one of the presentations saying, hey, Joe, did you know about this 5-month strike that took place shortly after the things that were happening at Berkeley? In San Francisco State University, this is the third world liberation. And within this, there was essentially, at San Francisco State, the BSU had went to admissions and talking a little bit about saying, hey, in order for us to be able to encourage more Black students and Black families to encourage your students to come here, we need to make sure that we're working on the retention of those folks and that we're being strategic about making sure of how we are creating spaces for those folks here. So admissions had come to agreement saying, all right, we are going to make sure that we are going through the process, and within that, they came to an agreement with the admissions that they're going to make sure that they have 400 slots that would be, go through the admission process to making sure that they were going to continue the diversity and expanding the diversity at San Francisco State. At that point, there were some other historically marginalized groups, for example, people within the API community and Latinx community, they're saying, hey, we also want to make sure that we have equal access to the educational component. And admissions response during that time was saying, well, you can share part of the numbers that we've put together to support the BSU, you all can work together on that. And essentially what the BSU said, hey, no, we're not going to give up our spots. We all deserve these opportunities to be able to have equity and access towards this education here. This is a public institution, and towards that began the 5-month strike. What it also did is it came up with the components of ethnic studies that being protected at the institution. Within there's things, the discussion being able to work towards saying they wanted to be able to have a developed area on the campus within the academic area focused towards ethnic studies and diversity and in increasing the diversity within the campus. So this 5-month strike went on throughout the time, trying to make it so that they could bring the voice of the students to making sure that the administration and the community were going to be able to understand where these students were coming from, the liberation for these students, as well as for them to make sure that they were that the institution was working towards equitability and access for the students at those institutions. So within that, we started to see the Third World Liberation Front. A lot of the movement that was there was coming through Chicanx students, Latinx students, the Filipinx students, all working towards making sure that their voice was being heard, that they were having a chance to be able to share the impacts that were happening for them by not having a diverse institution. So as they were working towards that, there were many times that they had shifted the experience, that it was being portrayed that that spots were being taken from students that, well-deserving students, were not getting spots or given away to people who had not earned their way there, which was not the case, right? And this has happened throughout history of things going, saying, they're just giving these spots away. So within that, they're continue to have movement and support at other institutions. And so the institutions that started at Berkeley, right, they also started this movement towards ethnic studies, trying to work toward that. But the other thing on the liberation movement was that, and this continues to happen too, is that there are many people that were doing the work that were not being acknowledged. And so, for example, there were many women that were putting their bodies on the line, doing some of this work that weren't being acknowledged. And it's important too that those folks were also being acknowledged, particularly in the Liberation Front that was happening there. There was one particular individual that has had an opportunity to have that voice be heard. And within that, Wadi, and let me make sure that I'm saying the name, sorry. Juanita Tomeo was one of those folks that was identified as a Filipinx student that was really working towards finding and gathering people together. But there was also some other Asian American students that were there. Lauren Chu was one of those people, Betty Kano, Petty Nakatsu, as well as Victoria Wong. Those folks, if you look within the newspapers and you look within the articles, those are not the names that are being celebrated. Those are not the names that are being shared upon, that these were folks that were also doing the work. So it's very important when we look at this history and the free speech movement and the liberation movement at institutions, that we go back and make sure that we're giving credit to those folks who were doing that work, right? It took many people to do that, but in many cases, when we look at the BIPOC folk, their names are not being acknowledged as much as they should have been. And also women were not being acknowledged with all the leadership and things that they were doing. So I think it's important things that need to change, that we start to work towards that, to making sure that those stories are being told. And that was some important things for me and my self-education, realizing there were more things that I needed to do, and that we needed to remember those names as we were doing that work. Something to know about, while these things were happening, and Berkeley, as well as at San Francisco State, there were also things that were happening here at UC Davis, right? And so that the process of diversifying the institution and having more access for students, as well as trying to protect and create ethnic studies on the campus, this was also going on. And so there was a pivotal moment that was happening in 1969, to where these students had, came to the campus, working towards trying to make sure that they were having it. And from my understanding, there was about 5,000 students that worked on this march on campus coming to that. And the chancellor at that time, it was James Mayer. The former chancellor at that time was Murack, and with Murack was in support of that. There needed to be work on the campus towards being able to have a safe place for ethnic studies to build and to grow, and that we work towards the diversity of the institution and making sure that we're honoring the land grant that's received from the institution. So in some cases, some people are saying, there's all these things that are happening on these other campuses, but what was happening here at Davis? There were things that were also happening here at Davis during that time. I'm going to move forward in a few other things to kind of just give, like, through the decades, some other things that were going on at institutions. One of the things in the 60s and the 70s, we saw both the civil rights movement that was going on, but again, there was also the anti-war movements of things, of students being able to, making sure that, they wanted to have their voices heard. They wanted to make sure that they were holding the institutions where they were attending accountable for some of their business practices and things that we're doing. So one of those historical moments was at UC Santa Barbara. And at UC Santa Barbara, there was a particular incident. Was that it started a peaceful protest that was at Perfect Park. They were acknowledging that the students wanted there to be boycotts of Bank of America, particularly. And particularly because of that, Bank of America at that time was allegedly giving funds to illegal loans to South African countries that were in support of the apartheid that was going on and taking place there. So within this protest, this was moving on within Santa Barbara. There was also other protests that were going on. Another acknowledgement too that was happening in Santa Barbara was oil spill that had taken place off the coast of Santa Barbara. And so there was also UC Santa Barbara students that were out there, and you'll see one of the pictures that there in the right corner is that demonstration that's taking place, which eventually led to the first Earth Day at college campuses. And that was a movement that was starting at college campuses. But below, you'll also see some of the anti-war movement that was going on, and there was a historical, unfortunate moment that took place at Kent State. During that time, it was on May 4th, at Kent State, the National Guard had been called out, and the students that were there, if you look in that front, the Bring All Troops Students Mobilizations. In that, if you'll look a little bit closer within there were 6 students that were there at Kent State. So those students, Allison Beth Krause, Sandra Lee, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, and William Knox. I'm sorry, the 4 students, the National Guard opened fired, and those 4 students were killed during that time, right? So this was a very pivotal moment during that time, as other allegations were going on at Richard Nixon during that time. So I want to acknowledge that those folks put their bodies on the line to try to make change, to try to get both their institutions where they're attending and the government to make sure that their voices were being heard, right? And representation was taking place, to find out what things needed to happen and the accountability that needed to come both from the institutions and from the government. So we move a little bit more towards the 80s. And in the 80s, some of the things that we were seeing there was continual movement against the apartheid, right? And so within that, there were several different movements that happening on many different campuses where these protests taking place. If you look there up in the left corner, I'm trying to visualize these things here, but up in the left corner, you'll see many folks that are there within the quad. That's at Occidental College. I formerly worked at Occidental College for some time. And at Occidental College, one of the things that they've discussed many times is that former President Barack Obama was a student there, and during that time led a movement against the apartheid and the institution's accountability of what they needed to do and the voices they wanted to hear and representation that speaking out against the apartheid that was happening in South America. And so there was also happening at many other institutions at that time. You'll see that one of the shanties that's putting there, I believe, was set up at UCLA, and different components there to where these students really trying to get their voice heard and wanting the institutions to be acknowledged, wanting the government to acknowledge what they needed to do and the accountability that needed to take place in order for change to happen. Moving forward, there was some pivotal events that took place at college institutions. I kind of stepped forward because I want to make sure that there's some time to be able to discuss the things here, is that there was the Occupy Wall Street events that were taking place. And eventually at college campuses, we also saw what was happening in Wall Street. There was also the occupations that were happening at the institutions. Within that, there was a prolonged process that was happening at the college institutions. And as we all know, here here at Davis, those things were taking place here. And after many of days, essentially at that time, what was happening is what we now know as the pepper spray incident. And so within that pepper spray incident, those students that were there had been asked to move. Those demonstrated were there in the pathway that's within the campus quad. And a decision was made at that time that they were pepper sprayed within that. And so based on that horrible event that took place, an event that we continue here at UC Davis to try to figure out what has needed to be learned, what changes can be made. There were things that took place that led to there needs to be a call for change about how we approach some of these things that are happening on our campus. How do we better serve the students that are here? How do we create more space for student expression on this campus and within the UC system? So what took place with that is that there was essentially a report that took place, what's called the Robinson-Edley report. And after looking at those things and some events that took place in November during that time at Berkeley, the Robinson-Edley report came back with saying, here's some adjustments that need to be made so that institutions can better serve the students. And so within that, part of the things is that reevaluating and looking about what are some of the challenges that are taking place, that there needs to be a better approach towards relationship building with the students, right? And particularly understanding and acknowledging that student affairs that are working there with the students could be some of those people that are the best to respond and to work with those students because of the relationships that they have. There is more importance on defining the role and the coordination of what's taking place in rallies and demonstrations on campus, that there would be specific hiring and training for folks to be able to have specialization of how they could respond and taking a different approach within these things. The importance on taking into account of that communication with those folks that are protesting or during a demonstration or within a rally, that how they would respond during those events, documentation of the things that were taking place so that there's accountability of these are the things that were taking place during that time, to make sure to look then after a post-event to see, okay, do we have those things of what we could do different, what we can continue to grow in, and then within those things, how can these things be implemented? So within that, this eventually led to the component of what we have here at UC Davis was the response team. And so I joined this response team in 2018, the fall of 2018. And within this was an opportunity for us to figure out how can we best support student expression on our campus, right? How can we best support that as an institution? We want to make sure that students have the right and that the free speech is protected for them. So within that, some of the things that this response team has worked towards is how we're able to work with students in advance of the event to kind of know, like, if there's a speaker that is coming on campus, if there's an event that's coming on campus, how are we able to be there and asking them what support looks like. And often, many of the cases when I've met with some of the students, many of the times they'll say is just be there. If you can just be there in case that something comes up, in case questions come up, being there is one of the things that they found is most important. For us to be able to share information with those people who are organizing, as well as to be able to, if I'm not able to answer questions, that I'm able to work and refer to those who might be able to answer those questions, right? The other component is to let, there are some people who might feel uncomfortable when they're hearing some of these things or seeing some of these things on campus, but letting people know that, hey, while they may get a call that, hey, these things are happening on campus, that the response team is able to be there to say, yes, people are uncomfortable, but there's still components of that. There's not a threat towards safety. The students we're in their right to be able to gather together to share and express their things, even if it's grievances towards the institution or grievances to things that are happening that they want to be able to work towards social change within that. In some of the cases, it's being able to provide information about campus policies and to navigate those campus policies, right? So, the university's policies can sometimes be very, as a student, I can imagine, could be very difficult for us to understand that. So as a response team, sometimes we are able to help them understand, well, these are their parameters, these are things to be able to work with, but here's all the availability of how you can be able to meet your goals still within some of the components of that parameter within there. critical component of it is communication, right? So making sure that we open the door for communications, and and when welcome, that communication is going through both the people who are organizing as well as through those people who are responding, as well as in passing it up to leadership. The other component of, as we've mentioned before, time, place, and manner, right? So be able to understand that, well, if we're not able to do these things in this way, is there other options? And that we work with saying, like, can we find those potential options? Are there things that we can do to make sure that the students have that access to student expression? The whole goal of this is that we want to empower students, right? In that support of student expression, we're promoting student safety, making sure that students feel they have that opportunity for expression here, and redetermining. And I think that a lot of our students are helping us through that process of redefining what safety means, right? We've had, over the last couple of years, the advisors to the chancellor have really tried to help us better understand what does safety look like, and who is the person best to provide what safety looks like, and is there a different approach that we might be able to take towards that? And so as we've gotten that feedback, and we're working towards that feedback and making some of those adjustments to better support the students, it's been really great learning opportunities for us to reevaluate the approach that we're taking here at UC Davis. The other thing is, there's at times that we want to make sure that we're providing that opportunity for advocacy for the students' concerns. We want to encourage students with different opinions to be able to have those discussions with each other, right? It's the whole component of talking about the marketplace of ideas. When social change has many times come from college institutions, right? Because people wanting to see that there's a different way, there's a different process, there's different ideas and concepts. And when an institution has allowed, when students at that institution feel they have the ability to be able to do that, is when we've been able to see change. And we want to continue to do that in those opportunities. And we're really there to oftentimes, in some cases, it's de-escalating situations, right? So there's sometimes there when situations could get to a point to where students can get angry or displaying some intense disruption towards each other on some things. And sometimes the student response teams are able to, like, hey, can we talk through a little bit more about what's going on? Is there a different approach in there, and providing an opportunity for some students to be able to take a step back if needed, to be able to say, how can I, is there a different approach that I can, with understanding there's some opposition to the ideas that might be shared? How can I best be able to find a way that's conducive for a potential conversation? And if not at that moment, can dialogue happen later? So that's some of the work that we're there to do, that we continue to work towards to better understand. My commitment towards continuing self-learning, as well as learning from our students. In many cases, students have asked when I've been at events, it's like, hey, Joe, you're coming to these events, have we ever been able to change your mind? Or is there, as we've changed your stance on stuff? And I've told students, I said, one of the things I can say to you is that you all continue to help me learn more and more about gaps in areas to where I've not been able to have access, where I need to do more work, where I need to do continual learning. And I appreciate those opportunities, but I also have to do the work myself as an individual to do more of that, and can't expect that the students are going to be the one teaching me all these things, right? So they may point me in the right directions, like, hey, here's some articles to read. Have you thought about these things? And that kind of is what got me through this journey, for me to better understand what are the voices that I wasn't hearing about the free speech movement, about the liberation at campus, colleges, and institutions, towards making sure that we're best supporting and continue to learn ways for student expressions on our college campuses. There is a website that was developed, and there's been other institutions that have also come together with similar different websites, trying to work towards, how do we support student expressions on our campus? And so you're more than welcome to look at this website. Within there, it's studentexpression.ucdavis.edu. And on that website, it presents that model of, we want to present opportunities for learning for both students, faculty, and staff, to better understand more about the components of what free speech is, how it can be, how different ways it can be demonstrated, and that leads into the act, right? So there's lots of different ideas about, when being able to making sure that we have that space to express our opinions, to work towards advocacy towards our own groups or other groups in support of other areas. It gives a little bit more information within that. And then the other component is support, right? So how do we support our students who felt that they, in the components where they felt maybe that their opinion was not being taken into consideration, where they felt like there might have been speakers on campus that they wanted to make sure that they were able to express their own ideas to where we find out, well, how can we best support you? Is it you having an event? Is it supporting you to be able to making sure that you have space for you to be able to share and making sure that your ideas about a certain particular topic are also being able to be expressed and shared on campus with the resources that you have available to you as the institutions. Lots of information there. And I apologize, I went through some of it very quickly, but I want to hear from you all if there's some questions that you all might have, or maybe there's some other areas of gaps that, hey, Joe, have you thought about these other areas? Are there some other things that could provide more research, provide more knowledge for me as well? Questions that folks might have, things I've seen, and now some things that are in the chat there. Maybe either, I'm not sure if you can put within the chat, how many of you learned a little bit more about some of the incidents that have taken place over the years that have led to and continue to lead towards free speech on college campuses and the liberation for due process and rights for students on our college campuses? Anybody see or hear anything new? Maybe you're encouraged to think about, hey, I want to know more about some of these events and the history that's not always being told. I think one thing that I wanted to share when I was first talking with Megan about this is part of the, how is this connected towards our campus book project, right? And so in my learning process and in my learning journey within this is understanding the racism that was existing in this history and how it was being shared. And so that was something that for me as I read more and more about this, is like, wow, why are these stories being not necessarily sensationalized, but why are these stories having more access that people can be able to find this information much quicker, and these other stories not being told? And so the sexism and racism that within that, saying we need to make that change, and what are things that I can do to make that change? So one, self-knowledge, but as well as providing other opportunities for other folks to be able to discuss and learn from each other on these areas. Tom, I think your hand is raised. Was there a question that you had or a comment that you wanted to share?
Perhaps a nice blend of both. So
Sure.
Thank you for the history. And of course, as a historian, I very much appreciate your stepping back to kind of some of the antecedents to what is officially called the free speech movement. But of course, as you explained, it goes back much further than that. And I have a question that is also in part a preface to an invitation to speak with you about this further. Our office has recently been given a grant from UCOP. It's called Dialogues Across Difference, that is looking at disruptive speech in the classroom. And I know that you are, a lot of what you talked about and what your job is focused on is kind of public spaces in the university where the First Amendment tends to reign supreme. And that idea that speech is free, except for the most kind of egregious examples, and even then perhaps still protected, can severely disrupt a learning environment, both for the instructor, the TA, as well as other students who might feel that speech is an attack on their identity and their experiences. And so I'm wondering kind of what your kind of thoughts or comments you might have or experiences about the difference between someone who wants to say something offensive and crazy in the quad versus someone who wants to say that provocative, disruptive, hateful type of speech in a learning environment.
Thank you, Tom. And I think that's some really good components to bring up and thoughts within there, that the academic freedom and how that is acknowledged at institution, as well as what's taking place within the public space, right? And there is this separation between what's happening within the classroom and the faculty member that's teaching that class, of how that is, how something might be approached within the context of the class of how they're teaching, and what they consider to be disruptive of that lesson or the area that they're working through, as well as then what's happening out at something within the quad, right? There is a lot of research in the discussion of that. They're, acknowledging that, hate speech is protected, right? And so, and there's the concept that's unfortunate is that there's sometimes this idea of coming to an institution and not hearing harmful speech, and the institution just cannot provide that. There's not an ability with that. But can we support a student talking through some of those discussions within that, and that balance of finding that students are hearing things that are contradictory to their own ideas, that they have opposition within those ideas, to be able to, how can we create space to be able to discuss some of those things? But then the component of what's happening within the classroom, to where a student might say is like, hey, the way that the faculty member is going down this topic contradicts my own opinions and my own ideas, and I don't feel that I can share my opposing ideas and things towards that. So there's a lot of research within that areas. And even with our own institution there, we have one of our professor, Brian, who's at the law school, has been trying to talk about how do we support faculty as we're trying to expand those ideas and concept of getting into conversations that could be uncomfortable, to talk about different ideas and concepts within an area, to be able to create civil discussions and be able to really challenge thought processes within a way to continue the learning within that. And so to look at some of those research, I'm going to encourage people to check out this website. This is the National Center for Free Speech. The National Center for Free Speech was something that after, this was something that Janet Napolitano had put some funds and resources towards, saying, hey, after the things that have taken place, and particularly a lot of this came forward after the incidents that were taking place with Milo Yiannopoulos at some of the different campuses within the UC system, saying, we've got to look at this in a different way. And we've got to look at it and to find out, how do we move through this? How do we provide more education? How can the institutions learn from more of these opportunities? And so this center has done a lot of research in these areas. And so I invite you to definitely take care and take a look at some of these areas within that. But there is a very much a difference between what's happening within the classroom and what's happening out in the public space. And what's happening in the classroom, a lot of that is predicted by the person who's teaching within that class, as well as then with how it's approached within the guidelines of the academic freedoms within that. But out in the quad, much of that, it's very much different of how we're trying to work with the time, place, and manner, content neutral, and how we're providing support for those students who are having the different ideas. Is there opportunities for us to be able to encourage students to challenge themselves for, how do I have these discussions, looking at discussing things that are different from my own thoughts and opinions? How can I have conversations about potential areas where there might be conflicts, where there might be these oppositions? Are there opportunities for us to have sustained dialogues? And that's something some of our students are doing research. If you check out from the National Center for Free Speech, we have, there was a program here, Sustained Dialogues, that have been going on for many years, that are some of our students now are working towards bringing that back and doing some of that training, so that we can find ways that, how do we encourage discussions about these topics? That's a sustained dialogue, looking for some way for be able to look for for change, in the campus, and looking for a change towards restorative justice is some ideas that might come through that. That's long-winded. Hopefully somewhere within there, Tom, I answered some of that, or created more opportunities for us to continue some of that research and learning in there. How about other questions, comments, feedback from other folks? Again, I think for me, this was an area to, I needed to learn more. And I'm really appreciative that my position here on this campus, we're one of the, right now, currently as an institution within the UC system, 60% of my job is working towards how do we better support students on the pathway for student expression. And a lot of that, like I was saying, is me learning from our students for them to identify what support looks like, for me to continue to find out from other institutions what are some of the promising practices. I don't like to use the word best practices, because I think that what might work at one institution may not always work at another institution, but are there some things that could be adopted at the institutions of where we're working for? And I've had opportunities to work and do some research with the National Center for Free Speech that provided opportunities of that students here on this campus in working towards them understanding that, hey, I don't even know if I have understand what conflict management is or how my approach to conflict management. So we were able to provide some opportunities for them to do some skill building on conflict management, conflict resolution, and the students finding after taking that there was pre-test, post-test, definitely willing to share more information if people are interested in this, about them realizing that them better understanding conflict management styles help them be able to build stronger relationships, as well as for them to better to role model the principals community on our campuses. And so there is great opportunities there that I don't know if I would have had those opportunities to be able to myself learning and provide opportunities for students at other institutions. So I'm so grateful this opportunity for the Student Expression and Campus Activities Coordinator opened up here at Davis, and the support that I'm receiving across campus as we try to redefine what support looks like for our students. Other questions, thoughts?
Joe, you mentioned the conflict resolution and communication workshop, which you've shared information with me about, and is a really exciting, promising practice, as you've said. Mm-hmm. Are there other promising practices that you've learned that maybe were really unique or novel coming to you?
I think one of the promising practices is the availability for students, right? And so within that, students feeling that they can come to us and talk to some of the things about it. And even if they're not in agreement with the institutional approach, them being able to be validated that we took the time to hear some of those things has been really, really important. And sometimes just listening to students has been really important for that student to feel like they're validated on some of the things, and gives them a chance to be able to, what's the next level that I can go through? So being there, providing opportunities for open doors for students to be able to meet with us. I think the other component of it is that is looking at, like I was saying, at other institutions. What are things that have been working well? The National Center for Free Speech has been a great learning opportunity for me to hear across the nation about other institutions and things that they're doing in support of free speech on college campuses and civic engagement. So that has been some really promising practicing coming there. There's also within the UC system, there's been a work group that's come together in support of student expression. And so this group has been coming together, having dialogue about at each of the institutions, what are some things. For example, a couple of weeks ago, UC Irvine talked about things that they were doing to train their staff about how to better approach situations that may come up in rallies and demonstrations, and that training that they as individuals who are responding to those things could be doing better and practicing, right? So that's one of the things that came out in the conflict management resolution training, is that we can be better at using those skills if we practice those skills. And so Irvine was doing some really great opportunities for the people to go through some simulations about some simulations and case studies, how to be able to learn from those situations that have happened in the past, so that they could be better prepared to support students. Well, I just want to thank you all for being here, the opportunities for me to continue to learn with folks, the support that from you all, as well as from the campus community book project. It is, you know, and I'll pass to Megan on these. There's some really great opportunities, and really hope some of you will be able to continue to attend some of these sessions in there. And I know Megan will be talking about some of the things that will be coming up, but thank you so much for being here and this opportunity for us to have the discussion and time together with each other.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciated your presentation. And I'm really appreciative of the connection between the history to practice today and making that connection, because I think that's feedback that I've heard around our campus community, not necessarily having that opportunity to pause and learn about the history, to understand why we do things the way we do them now. Not to say that things can't be improved, but I think really to illuminate the fact that everything continues to be a work in progress. So really appreciate your presentation. So as we're closing out, just want to invite folks to our next Campus Community Book Project program. We hope that you can join us next Monday, November 8th at 5:30 p.m. We'll be screening the documentary Racially Charged, America's Misdemeanor Problem. And we're going to host a panel discussion featuring local criminal justice leaders, which will include School of Law professor Irene Joe, Yolo County Public Defender Tracy Olson, Yolo County Chief Deputy District Attorney Jonathan Raven, and West Sacramento Police Chief Rob Strange. The event is going to be co-moderated by Megan Chung, who is an undergraduate student scholar at UC Davis. She is our ASUCD representative and chair of the Police Accountability Board. You can register for this event on the Book Project website, and all are free at this free program, or all are welcome at this free program. And as folks are leaving, want to extend the invitation to share your feedback on today's event. We invite you to complete a brief survey, which you can access via the QR code or web address listed on the screen. As an incentive and thank you for your participation in the survey, at the end, you will have the opportunity to enter into a prize drawing for a ticket to see this year's book project featured author, Ibram X. Kendi, at the Mondavi Center on March 31, 2022. So again, thank you in advance for your participation in this survey. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and wishing everyone a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.